be really interested in your views and thoughts about that. So I'll pause there and see if anyone's got any different or opposing views around the use of cannabis in young people. It's always a hot topic, I find.
Yeah, I mean, people call cannabis the gateway drug, but my concern is young adolescents using cannabis and the potential for mental health concerns, schizophrenia. I mean, it's not going to happen to all, but if there is an underlying history of schizophrenia within the family, that there is potential for it to be triggered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I worry that we're losing that kind of that point, really, because we know that there's a growing body of evidence and research that highlights that link between mental health and cannabis misuse, particularly for young people that start to misuse cannabis before the age of 14 as well. But the other thing as well that worries me is sometimes that we don't even question why a young person is using cannabis. I don't think I've ever worked with a young person who's misusing cannabis just because they like it. Most of the time, they use cannabis because it's helping to really sort of self-medicate and really diminish some quite unpleasant symptoms of trauma. I know that a lot of young people that are maybe sort of waiting neurodevelopmental assessments, they often will use cannabis as a means of coping with some of their symptoms too. And I don't think that we routinely employ that professional inquiry, that professional curiosity as to, well, why are you using cannabis? Yeah. I think it is just that assumption that it's something that young people do. And actually, I would argue that in the majority of cases, there's a reason.
Yeah, there's another thought behind it as well. I mean, I remember back in the day when I was a young kid, I mean, the Rastas would smoke a lot of cannabis and whatever, and the makeup of the cannabis was, from what I'm told, a balanced makeup. So you'd have a balanced THC, balanced CBD. So you could potentially, there are, you mean, in America, there is used for, you mean, medical use, but because it's underground and it's grown underground, you get in THC heavy cannabis, which, you mean, it can cause significant mental health problems.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was about to say something very similar to Anthony in that sense, because I think, you know, I suppose there's a level of cultural acceptance, you know, particularly in certain communities, you know, heavily influenced, like I myself, when I was growing up, heavily influenced by, you know, the Rasta community. You know, many of my, you know, my godparents, uncles, parents even, you know, belong to that faith. And so, yeah, like I said, there's a level of normalization, but at the same time, we are talking about probably a radically different substance that we're referring to today than we are back then. So just the evolution of cannabis itself, and of course the controversial almost declassification, going into a Class C drug at one particular point, then back to now a Class B drug. So, you know, cannabis is you know, it's in a very unstable territory, and ground, and lots of conflicting and conflating messages around that, which I think in some shape or form can, you know, influence, you know, lots of young people, and again, a massive, especially when you're coming from, you know, areas of massive deprivation and poverty, where you know, cannabis is almost normalized. It's part of normal growing up in everyday society. So yeah, that was my 2 pennies worth. But I'll come back to that. I think that was going back to the exchange argument, and Damien was just saying, yeah, mind altering drug cannabis can be, as Anthony just referred to. Megan is saying, young people in our service often talk about experiencing sleeping issues, often linked to trauma, and using cannabis as they feel this helps them to sleep, but often ends up causing further issues, is one. And then Damon's also saying it's altered now CBD in oil form, which the levels vary, and the levels of THC content for medical use.
Yeah, so for those of you that have never heard of like THC or CBD, I suppose it's useful just to sort of give a bit of context to that. So the CBD element that's found in cannabis naturally occurring is the bit that produces the pleasant symptoms, the relaxation, the pain relief. The THC is a psychoactive element.
Yes.
And if it's not sort of medical grade cannabis, it's carefully cultivated, then what you tend to have is cannabis that's really high in THC, which is the component that can trigger some nasty flashbacks, some mental health symptoms, and it's sort of like the really highly addictive element to cannabis as well. And something also to say is that, you know, the UK is an end user of drugs, which essentially means that nearly all of the substances that is in use and in circulation in this country are imported from overseas, with the exception of cannabis, actually. About 50% of cannabis that's in circulation across England and Wales is actually homegrown, cultivated here, often cultivated in properties that have been cuckooed, so properties that have been taken over and used as cannabis farms. In COVID, there was nightclubs, because of the nighttime economy coming to an end, that were actually being used for massive cannabis grows. And the 50% of cannabis that isn't cultivated here tends to come from overseas. A lot of it's sort of Dutch grown heavy skunk, which is really high in that THC, and kids are smoking it. So, you know, real sort of health harms associated with cannabis that's doing the rounds. So there is an absolutely sort of growing argument about the legalization of cannabis, so making sure that cannabis that can be bought legally is sort of safer, cannabis more medicinal, but who knows where we'll go with that in the non too distant future. And so going back to sort of spotting the signs of CSE, sexualized behavior as well, harmful sexual behavior, something that's talked about a lot. So that can be like sexualized language, you know, quite sort of sexualized behavior. And for younger children as well, that's not sort of close to that sort of transition into adulthood, that might be more sort of pronounced. We might kind of think, okay, so where have they learned that behavior from? It might not be exploitation, because actually if we think about younger adolescents and children often have access to digital devices, iPads, their own phone. And if you think about the content on TikTok and Snapchat, some of that is really sort of sexualized, harmful content that they might be mirroring and modeling. But again, really important when you see that, when you see behavior that you think is not age appropriate, to have the confidence to actually explore where that behavior might have come from, because that can be a real indication of exploitation and abuse. Also sexting as well, you know, this is again really common. We see this happening increasingly commonly in schools. We do a lot of school-based work as an organisation. Teachers come to us all the time and say, I'm really concerned that it's normalised now to send self-generated nude or semi-nude images, or actually, you know, to be asking for images as well. So again, you know, we need to remember that when we're talking about exploitation, that often we have that stereotypical view of a child being exploited by someone who is significantly older, and that power imbalance playing out in terms of kind of disparity in age in that relationship. That is not always the case. What we see increasingly is children being exploited by children, and that adds an extra layer of complexity. So again, a key takeaway from this today is that it's not just about adults exploiting children, but actually peers exploiting their peers too.